It was a late afternoon in Dallas, Texas, sunlight spilling through my kitchen window, glinting off the phone that buzzed beside my cup of tea. I wiped my hands on a towel and looked down, expecting a message from my son about dinner plans. Instead, the words on the screen froze my breath. "We don't owe you anything. No greeting, no warmth. Just that." I stood still, the hum of the fridge louder than my heartbeat. My hands trembled, but my mind didn't. Because long before that message was sent, I had already signed something he forgot about. A contract with my name written clear as day. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and stay till the end. Because some debts aren't paid in money. They're paid in memory. Long before that message, before the phones and contracts, there was a time when life moved slower in Dallas, when the world still ran on hard work and hope. I was 29 when my husband passed away. A quiet man who built dreams with his hands and left behind more love than money. Our son was only 5. The morning after the funeral, I remember standing in the small kitchen of our rented home, sunlight filtering through the blinds, and promising him silently that I would never let him go without. That promise became my purpose. The years that followed were heavy but full. I worked 2 jobs, mornings as a clerk at a fabric store downtown, evenings cleaning offices in Oak Lawn. My hands always smelled of bleach and thread, and my back ached more nights than not. There were months when the bills came faster than the paychecks, but somehow, we made it. I skipped meals, sold jewelry, and wore the same coat winter after winter so he could have new shoes for school. Every sacrifice was small when compared to his smile. He grew up watching me stretch every dollar, every ounce of strength. There were nights he would sit by the table doing homework while I sewed clothes for neighbors. Sometimes he'd fall asleep with his head resting on the fabric pile, and I'd stop to brush the hair from his forehead, whispering that he'd never have to live like this. He would nod, half asleep, believing me completely. Those were the moments that stitched my world together. When he graduated from high school, I stood at the back of the auditorium, still in my uniform from work. I couldn't afford a new dress, but I clapped the loudest. He walked across that stage, and when his name was called, I felt 20 years of struggle lift for just a second. After the ceremony, he hugged me tight and said, "I'll make you proud." And for a while, he did. College was expensive, but I made it happen. I took another job at a diner near Main Street, working the graveyard shift to pay for his books and rent. Every paycheck was divided with precision, half to tuition, a little to groceries, the rest to utilities. I never told him how often I fell asleep at work, how my hands cracked from washing dishes, how I sometimes cried quietly in the bathroom between shifts. He didn't need to know the cost of his comfort. Love hides those details. When he called to say he'd gotten his first internship, my heart swelled. He sounded confident, busy, happy. I remember thinking that maybe all those sacrifices had finally turned into something solid, a future. He'd talk about the projects, the people he met, and how he wanted to start his own business someday. I would listen, smiling, imagining him in a suit and tie, sitting in one of those glass offices downtown. And then, one day, that dream became reality. He launched his company, and I was there, the quiet supporter in the corner, smiling while he made speeches. I had mortgaged my small house to help him fund it, every dollar of my savings wrapped into his ambition. When the lawyer drafted the contract, he'd said, "Make sure your name stays on the papers, Mrs. Carter." I had agreed, but I told him I'd never use it against my son. "This isn't business," I said. It's love. He nodded, though something in his eyes said he'd seen too many stories like mine end differently. In those early days, I would visit his office sometimes with home-cooked lunch, the smell of stew filling the elevator. The employees would smile, calling me Mom, and I'd laugh, pretending to belong in that modern glass world. He'd walk me to the door, proud, introducing me to everyone. Those were good years, the kind that trick you into believing success can't spoil what love built. But success changes things quietly. It doesn't storm in. It seeps through cracks of pride. As his company grew, his calls became shorter, his visits home fewer. The boy who once hugged me after every achievement began to treat me like an obligation. I told myself it was just work, just pressure. But deep down, I felt the distance growing, an invisible wall built brick by brick with each unanswered call, each delayed visit, each new excuse. Still, I never stopped helping. When his business struggled in the second year, I sold the last few pieces of gold jewelry I had left, gifts from my wedding, to keep his payroll running. I didn't tell him. Mothers don't ask for gratitude. We survive on the hope that our children will remember. Years passed. The company grew stronger. He bought a big house in the suburbs, married a woman I thought would bring warmth into his life. I attended their wedding in a simple blue dress, proud and teary-eyed. I handed him an envelope with the last payment of the mortgage that had once been taken for his dream. "Now you're free," I said softly. I meant it in every way. For a while, everything looked fine from the outside. He visited on holidays, sent me gifts I never asked for. But there was something mechanical about his kindness, as if each gesture was rehearsed. And then, slowly, even those visits stopped. The calls turned into texts. The texts turned into silence. Until that message. "We don't owe you anything." Those words were the mirror image of everything I had lived for. They took the shape of every late night, every sacrifice, every ounce of love that had gone unacknowledged. It was the sound of a door closing between a mother and a son who had forgotten where his success came from. That night, as I sat in my kitchen, I thought about how love often demands silence, how mothers are taught to bear pain quietly. But I realized silence had made him forget. It had erased my name from the story he now told about himself. I looked at my reflection in the window, the same tired eyes, the same hands that had built his beginning. I didn't look angry. I looked awake. He said he owed me nothing, but I knew the truth. He owed me everything he stood on, and I had the paper to prove it. After the message, I spent nights tracing the slow fade that had led us here. Distance never arrives suddenly. It seeps in like fog. Quiet, patient, unseen until everything around you feels dim. When my son married, I had believed life would finally settle. The wedding in Austin, Texas was beautiful. White magnolias on every table, the river breeze carrying laughter across the lawn. I remember standing near the back, watching him promise forever to the woman beside him, and telling myself, this is happiness. For a while, it was. They invited me over every Sunday. She'd call me Mom, bring out iced tea, ask for my recipes. The sound of their laughter had filled me like sunlight after a long winter. But warmth can turn to politeness faster than seasons change. A year later, the invitations came less often. The laughter softened into scripted smiles. Whenever I called, it was her voice that answered, not his. Sweet, but rehearsed. "He's busy, Mom. He'll call later." Later always became never. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself young couples needed space. that I was expecting too much. But the heart feels what pride tries to silence. Every time I stood at their doorstep holding a casserole dish, I felt the pause before she opened the door. The welcome was always there, but thinner, like a curtain drawn between affection and obligation. One day, I noticed something small. She had replaced the photo of me on the mantel with one of their trip to New Orleans. I smiled and said nothing. But that night, back home, I stared at my own walls, bare, familiar, loyal, and understood that I had been quietly edited out of their story. The calls grew rarer after that. Holidays were reduced to messages sent in bulk, the kind with generic greetings and too many emojis. My birthday arrived without a visit. He sent flowers through a delivery service, the kind that come with a printed note. The handwriting wasn't his. Still, I kept loving them the way mothers do, endlessly, even when unseen. I sent care packages, jam, quilts, old family recipes written by hand. Sometimes the boxes came back unopened, returned to sender. Each one felt like a soft slap wrapped in tape. Then came the excuses. When my roof began leaking after a storm, I called him for help. He said money was tight, though I'd seen their vacation photos from Los Angeles days earlier. When I mentioned hospital bills from a knee injury, he promised to check in soon, but weeks passed without a word. That's when I stopped asking. There's a kind of silence that grows when love turns transactional. When every act of care is measured like a debt instead of given like a gift. Even the neighbors noticed. "You don't see your boy much anymore," Mrs. Ray from next door said one morning as we watered our lawns. I smiled and lied. "He's busy." But inside, I knew it wasn't busyness that kept him away. It was comfort. Comfort makes people forget who built their beginnings. The shift became undeniable one Thanksgiving. I arrived at their house with a pie in hand, excited to see them. When the door opened, her face fell for a split second before she masked it with a smile. The dining table was already full, her family, her friends, laughter echoing through rooms I once helped decorate. She offered me a chair at the corner of the table, away from conversation, as if kindness were charity. I smiled, ate quietly, and left early. On the drive home, the city lights blurred through my tears. After that, I stayed away. It wasn't pride. It was protection. I didn't want to watch my love shrink any further. Weeks passed, then months. The phone remained silent. The loneliness no longer hurt. It numbed. Until one night, when the message came. "We don't owe you anything." It was the perfect summary of all the unspoken things that had been building for years. Not just words, but confirmation. That love had been replaced by entitlement. That the line between family and favor had been crossed. I sat in my small living room, staring at the old clock ticking above the fireplace. Every sound in that room, the hum of the fridge, the groan of the wooden floor, reminded me of what I had built alone. Every inch of it had been earned through sacrifice, through faith, through work. And now, the child who grew up under that roof had forgotten what a roof meant. But grief has a strange way of clearing the air. That night, something inside me shifted from sorrow to steel. I wasn't angry. I was awake. I realized that I had spent years asking for what was already mine. Love, respect, remembrance. No more. The world outside was dark, the Dallas skyline glowing faintly in the distance. I looked out through my kitchen window, saw the reflection of the city lights against the glass, and made myself a promise. I would no longer chase kindness. I would remind them, quietly, who had laid the foundation they stood on. The beginning of distance had also become the beginning of my clarity. Love, when unreciprocated, becomes a mirror. It shows you the difference between what you gave and what was deserved. And I had given everything. That night, I placed the phone face down on the table, opened the cabinet, and pulled out the folder. The papers rustled softly. My name, my signature, my worth written in ink. They thought the distance had erased me. They were about to learn it had only made me visible again. It happened on a Wednesday. One of those plain, ordinary evenings when nothing feels dramatic until the world decides otherwise. I had just finished folding laundry in the living room, the television humming faintly in the background. The news anchor on Channel 8 Dallas was talking about rising prices and storms moving in from the west. I remember thinking about how quiet the house felt that night, how the hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than usual. Then, my phone buzzed. The sound was small, harmless, but it changed everything. I reached for it without thinking, expecting maybe a message from my neighbor or one of those cheerful goodnight texts from an old church friend. But when I looked at the screen, I saw his name. My son. My heart skipped. The kind of skip that mixes joy and relief. He hadn't called in weeks. Maybe he missed me, I thought. Maybe he remembered. But what I opened wasn't a hello. It was a sentence that felt like a verdict. We don't owe you anything. I froze. For a long moment, I just stared at it. The air seemed to thicken. The lights felt dimmer, and the walls of my little living room began to close in. I read it again and again, the words digging deeper each time, stripping away layers of hope I didn't know I was still holding. There was no greeting, no explanation, just that one line. It felt rehearsed. Not written in a moment of anger, but planned, as if someone else had helped him compose it. Maybe his wife. Maybe the same person who'd replaced my photo on the mantel. The clock ticked loudly behind me, marking each second like a heartbeat I couldn't slow. My hands shook, and I set the phone down gently on the coffee table, afraid that if I gripped it any tighter, I'd break it. But something else had already broken. Outside, the wind picked up. I could hear the faint whistle through the cracks of the window frame. My old dog Max stirred on the couch and looked up at me, sensing the tension. I reached out and stroked his head, more for my comfort than his. The message wasn't long, but it carried years of weight. It wasn't just words. It was a declaration, the kind that rewrites history in a single breath. We don't owe you anything. I whispered the phrase under my breath, testing how it sounded aloud. It was colder that way. That was the moment I realized something vital. My son no longer saw me as his beginning. He saw me as an inconvenience, a reminder of debts he wanted to forget. And yet, as those words settled in, my mind drifted somewhere else, to the folder in the cabinet near the dining table. The same folder I had touched countless times before, only to close it again, trusting love to be stronger than paper. Inside it lay a contract, old, yellowed, but binding. It bore both our names, printed in neat ink. It was a partnership agreement from when I had mortgaged my house to fund his company's launch. My investment, my faith, my safety net for him. I had signed away years of security so he could stand taller. He had forgotten that. He had forgotten that every wall of his office, every chair, every desk, every brick of the building had a thread of me woven through it. The mother who gave up sleep so he could dream. I stood up, walked slowly to the cabinet, and opened it. The hinges creaked, protesting like an old friend tired of secrets. I pulled out the folder, its edges frayed and soft from time. My name was still there on the front, in fading black ink. Margaret Turner. His name was beside it. I ran my finger over the signature lines, one written in a careful, steady hand, the other hurried and uneven, the way he always signed when he was excited. He had been so proud back then. "We're a team, Mom," he'd said after signing. I had believed him. I had believed every word. But teams don't send messages like that. Teams don't erase the people who built them. I placed the contract on the table next to the phone and sat back down. My breathing steadied. The pain was still there, raw and pulsing, but something colder had begun to form around it. A kind of steel calm that only comes from being done with excuses. He said he owed me nothing, but the truth was written right there, in ink that hadn't faded. I didn't need to reply to his message. I didn't need to fight through words anymore. Words had become his weapon. I would use what he'd forgotten: paper, law, and memory. For years, I had kept that contract, because the lawyer told me to. "You never know," he'd said. "Sometimes love isn't enough protection." I had laughed then, offended at the thought. Now I understood exactly what he meant. The night grew darker. The television still hummed in the background, talking about weather and politics and all the other noise that fills the world. I turned it off. Silence returned, heavier but cleaner. I stared at the contract under the lamplight. My signature looked stronger than I remembered. His looked smaller. That was when I made my decision. I would remind him, not with anger, not with shouting, but with the kind of truth that carries weight even when spoken quietly. I would let the contract speak where love had been silenced. When I went to bed that night, I left the folder open on the table. The last thing I saw before turning off the lamp was the reflection of my name in the glass frame of our old family photo. It glowed faintly in the dark, like a memory that refused to fade. He had said he owed me nothing, but I had written my name on his forever. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was still, the kind of quiet that feels sacred after a storm. The clock read 5:47 a.m. I brewed coffee the way I always had, strong and simple, and sat by the window watching the faint orange light crawl over Reunion Tower in downtown Dallas. The city was waking up, but inside my small kitchen, time had slowed. I opened the same folder again, this time with no hesitation. The smell of old paper filled the air, that dry, familiar scent of something both fragile and powerful. There it was. The contract. Its edges were yellowed now, its corners soft from years of being moved and forgotten. But the ink was still dark, and the signatures still clear. I remembered the day it was signed like it had happened last week. My son was 24 then, full of energy, full of ambition, full of plans that sounded too big for the small dining table we sat at. He had a dream to start his own logistics business, and I had the means to help him. Or at least, I thought I did. I didn't have savings, but I had a house. A home built brick by brick through sacrifice, sitting quietly on the edge of North Dallas, filled with every piece of my life. He needed capital to secure a loan. The bank manager told him that if someone could guarantee it, the dream could become real. I didn't even hesitate. I told him I would mortgage my house. His eyes filled with tears. I remember that clearly because it was the last time I saw him cry for something pure. The lawyer had come over to explain the paperwork. His name was Mr. Dalton, a patient man who spoke carefully, as if he had seen too many families ruin themselves over trust. He spread the documents out across the kitchen table, the very spot where I had once taught my son to write his name. He looked at me and said, "Mrs. Turner, you must understand. This is a binding contract. Your name will be on everything. You'll have rights, real rights, in this business." I smiled then, naive and proud, and said, "I'm not doing this for rights. I'm doing this for my son." He paused, the kind of pause that feels like advice hidden inside silence. Then he nodded and said quietly, "Just make sure your name stays on the papers." And it did. For years, that single decision, that one signature, was my invisible proof of faith. I had believed in my son's dream so fiercely that I was willing to risk the only thing I owned. And when the business began to grow, when the first profits came in, when he bought his first car and called me from his office shouting, "We made it!" I didn't think of contracts or papers or percentages. I just thought of that boy who used to bring me school certificates with messy crayon borders. The contract was stored away, untouched. He sent small checks at first, little gifts that said thank you without saying the words. I never cashed most of them. I didn't help him to earn. I helped him to live. But as the years went by, the gratitude faded into distance. The boy who once shared every idea now shared nothing. And that contract, the one meant only for safety, became irrelevant in my heart until the night his message arrived. Now, under the morning light, I looked at it again, line by line, section by section. Each word carried memory and meaning. This agreement acknowledges that Margaret Turner retains a 40% ownership interest in Turner Logistics, LLC. 40%. Not just paper, but proof. I traced my name with my fingertip. Margaret Turner. It looked steady. No tremor, no doubt. Back then, I had signed it with complete trust. Now, it stood as the quiet witness to everything love had built and pride had forgotten. I sipped my coffee slowly, thinking of how life had circled back to this moment. Love had brought me into that contract. Betrayal had brought me back to it. It wasn't revenge. It was a reminder. People like to say mothers never forget. It's true. We never forget birthdays, or the sound of our child's first laugh, or the weight of their tiny hand gripping ours. But we also never forget promises, especially the ones made to our face and broken behind our back. He had said he owed me nothing, but I owed myself the truth. By mid-morning, I picked up the phone and called Mr. Dalton's office. His secretary recognized my name immediately. "Mrs. Turner," she said warmly, "Mr. Dalton's been retired for 2 years now, but he still checks his old messages. Would you like me to forward yours?" I smiled faintly. "Please do." An hour later, the phone rang again. That same calm voice from years ago greeted me. "Margaret Turner," he said, almost laughing. "I haven't heard that name in ages. Still have your contract framed somewhere, don't you?" "Not framed," I said softly, "but ready." He went quiet, and then I heard the shift in his tone, the one lawyers get when they know things have changed. "I assume this has to do with your son?" "Yes," I said. "He forgot who paid the first bill." He sighed, not with surprise, but with the sadness of recognition. They always forget. We spoke for an hour, about terms, renewal rights, ownership clauses. He promised to send official copies, notarized and stamped, to ensure my records were current. "You don't need to do anything yet," he said, "but you will soon. Just make sure you're ready." When I hung up, I looked around my house. Quiet, small, mine. Every inch of it had carried sacrifice once, and now it carried proof. I thought of my son's text again and whispered to myself, "Justice doesn't shout. It simply arrives on letterhead." That afternoon, I placed the contract in a new folder, clean and unbent. The old one had served its time. I wrote a label on the front. Turner Logistics, Mother's Share. My handwriting was steady. For the first time in years, my hands didn't shake. Outside, the sky was clear, and the wind had softened. The air felt lighter. Not because the pain had vanished, but because truth had taken its place. I wasn't planning revenge. I was remembering my worth. He had forgotten my name on the contract, but the world hadn't, and neither had I. The following days unfolded like calm before thunder, silent, slow, deliberate. I had no anger left in me, only purpose. I wasn't going to argue, plead, or explain. I had already done those things for years, in 1,000 small ways. Through dinners cooked, holidays remembered, messages unanswered. But this time, I would let the truth wear a suit and carry a seal. The morning after my call with Mr. Dalton, I brewed my coffee as usual and sat at the same kitchen table that had seen every season of my life. Laughter, sorrow, and now resolve. A thin stream of light slipped through the blinds, landing directly on the folder marked Turner Logistics, Mother's Share. It almost looked like sunlight had chosen a side. I opened it again, not to read, but to remind myself that love could coexist with boundaries. I wasn't trying to hurt my son. I was simply reclaiming the space where my worth had once lived quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. Mr. Dalton sent me copies of the documents by courier that afternoon, crisp, clean, and updated. When I opened the envelope, I saw my name again in bold, followed by the same clause that had once been my silent promise. 40% equity, non-transferable without written consent of the secondary party. That line was my shield now, one I had never planned to use, but one that had been waiting patiently in the shadows for this very moment. By evening, I had already drawn out a list of next steps on a yellow notepad. Step 1, gather documentation. Step 2, confirm business registration and legal status through the Texas Secretary of State's online portal. Step 3, notify the firm's legal department of ownership interest. Each task was small, quiet, powerful. The kind of steps women take when they've learned that calmness is the sharpest weapon. I took a photo of each page, stored it neatly in a folder on my laptop. Technology had never been my strength, but this time I made sure every proof was duplicated, in cloud storage, on a USB drive, and printed in triplicate. Experience teaches mothers 2 things. Never trust apologies too quickly, and never let evidence live in one place. The following morning, I visited my local post office near Main Street, Dallas, the one with the red brick front and the sleepy clerk who'd been there since my son was a boy. I handed over a registered envelope addressed to Turner Logistics headquarters. Legal department. Inside was a formal notice prepared with Mr. Dalton's help. A gentle legal reminder that I remained a partial owner and required disclosure of all financial reports. The language was polite, almost kind, but each line carried weight. The clerk stamped the envelope with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. I watched the ink dry, my name, bold and undeniable, sealed once more in time. Walking back home, the autumn wind brushed my hair, carrying the faint scent of roasted peanuts from the street vendor by the bus stop. The city moved around me, unaware that a quiet revolution had just begun. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of shift that begins when a mother remembers her own power. At home, I sat by the window and looked at the skyline. Dallas shimmered in the distance. Towers of ambition and glass, all built by people who thought success erased the hands that fed it. My son had become one of them. But now he would have to remember who gave him his first foundation. That night, I called Mr. Dalton again. "The notice is sent," I told him. "Good," he said. "Now we wait. Let their silence work for you." His words stayed with me. Silence. It had hurt me for years. But now it was my ally. I wouldn't reach out. I wouldn't argue. I would let the paperwork do the talking. Over the next week, I kept my life simple. Morning walks through White Rock Lake Park, groceries from the small farmer's market, quiet dinners alone. I told no one, not even my church friends. The fewer people who knew, the purer the plan stayed. Revenge whispered through gossip. Justice moved in silence. One evening, I caught my reflection in the window. Older, yes, but not weak. The woman who once cried in the dark over unanswered calls had become someone else. Patient, grounded, quietly dangerous in her clarity. I smiled faintly. Time had aged me, but it had also sharpened me. 3 days later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a junior associate from Turner Logistics' legal team. His voice was nervous, unsure. He asked if we could clarify certain ownership details and verify a few records. I listened quietly, offering no emotion, only facts. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair and exhaled. It had begun. By the end of that week, my son would receive his first formal letter from his own company, informing him that corporate structure reviews were underway due to a shareholder inquiry. He wouldn't see my name until the 3rd page. That was the beauty of it. The truth would arrive slowly, like dawn through thick fog, undeniable once seen. When the phone rang again that night, I didn't pick up. I knew it would be him. I let it ring, over and over, until the sound became nothing more than background noise. A tune I'd already outgrown. I looked down at my hands, old and lined but steady, and whispered to myself, "They told me to stay away." So I did, and took my house with me. I hadn't needed to shout, beg, or demand anything. I had just remembered the truth and acted on it. That's the quiet kind of revenge most people never see coming. The one written in calm letters and signed with patience. The next morning, I made another pot of coffee and watched the sunrise. The world looked the same, but I wasn't. My son had forgotten my name on the contract. Soon, he'd remember every letter of it. The letter reached them on a Thursday morning. Quiet, clean, official. No drama, no shouting, just truth printed in black ink on white paper. It was delivered by certified mail to their house in Plano, Texas, the same house I had once helped them choose, the one whose down payment I had covered when my son's credit was still too weak. I could almost picture it. The envelope on their polished kitchen counter, my name sitting quietly in the corner like a shadow they'd tried to forget. I didn't need to imagine what happened next. I had lived long enough to know how guilt sounds when it reads a letter. It starts with silence. Then, a shuffle of footsteps. Then, a sudden drop of breath that no apology can fix. The letter wasn't long, but it carried weight. It began with the formality only lawyers could craft. This notice serves as official reminder of the continued ownership interest of Mrs. Margaret Turner in Turner Logistics, LLC, comprising 40% of all shares and voting rights therein. No bitterness, no threats, just facts. Signed by my lawyer, stamped by the firm, and mailed with precision. By noon, I received 3 missed calls from my son. I didn't answer. By evening, 2 messages followed. Short, panicked, and clumsy. Mom, what's going on? And can we talk about this? The same fingers that once typed, "We don't owe you anything," now stumbled for words. I let the messages sit unread, their blue dots glowing like quiet revenge. The next morning, Mr. Dalton called to update me. "They've received it," he said simply. "Their counsel has already contacted us for clarification. You've got their full attention now." I thanked him and smiled faintly. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was justice breathing softly. That day, I went about my routine as if nothing monumental had happened. I watered the small plants on my porch, swept the walkway, and walked down to the Dallas Farmers Market for groceries. The city buzzed around me, unaware that a story decades in the making had just begun to correct itself. By the time I got home, there were more messages waiting. My son had called 9 times. The last voicemail began with his familiar voice cracking slightly. He tried to sound calm, but the tremor betrayed him. "Mom, I think there's been some misunderstanding. We should talk face to face." But there was no misunderstanding. There never had been. There had only been forgetting, and now remembering. I made tea, sat in my favorite chair, and finally played the voicemail once more. The same man who once told me I was owed nothing now sounded like a child trying to explain himself before the truth caught up. I didn't smile, I didn't cry, I just listened, and then deleted it. The weekend passed quietly. The world didn't explode, the sky didn't fall. But inside their home, I knew the storm was real. Lawyers talk in codes, but guilt talks in panic. Their company had been built on my name, my investment had been the seed, and now they realized that the soil still belonged to me. On Monday morning, a formal email arrived. It was polite, even flattering. "Dear Mrs. Turner," it began, "we'd like to request a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss partnership structure and possible resolutions." Resolutions? Such a careful word for what they had once dismissed as irrelevant. I replied with one sentence. "Please direct all correspondence through my attorney." The same afternoon, I received a message from an unknown number, his wife's. It read, "We didn't mean for this to get out of hand." I stared at it for a long moment. The irony was bitter and sweet all at once. This had been out of hand the moment they decided gratitude had an expiry date. I didn't reply. I had already spoken through the paper. The following day, my lawyer confirmed that they'd filed for a meeting. Their company was temporarily halting profit distributions until ownership verification was resolved. The move had caused tension among their board members. Apparently, not everyone liked surprises. I simply nodded when I heard it. I hadn't wanted to destroy anything. I had just wanted to remind them what stood beneath their success. That night, I took a slow walk through my garden. The air smelled of jasmine and wet soil, and the cicadas hummed softly under the Texas moon. I thought of all the years I had spent loving quietly, forgiving quickly, giving endlessly, and how, in the end, the thing that spoke for me wasn't my tears or my voice, but my signature. By the end of that week, the community had started whispering. In small towns and close circles, news travels like wildfire through polite curiosity. People asked careful questions, not out of malice, but fascination. Didn't she help build that business? Wasn't her name still on the papers? They didn't know the details, but the truth had a way of slipping through locked doors. Meanwhile, my son's messages changed tone. The confidence disappeared. Each text became softer, humbler, as if he was trying to rewrite history, line by line. "Mom, can we please talk? Mom, I'm sorry if I hurt you. Mom, I didn't mean it that way, but he had. I read each one and then turned off my phone. There was peace in the silence, peace in knowing that I no longer needed to explain my worth. The notice had already done that for me. Mr. Dalton called again the following week. "They're ready to negotiate," he said. "Negotiate?" I repeated softly. "There's nothing to negotiate. I just wanted them to remember." He chuckled lightly, that kind of half-sad laugh older men give when they've seen too much. "Sometimes, Margaret, remembering is the punishment." And he was right. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat by the window. The world outside was ordinary. Children playing, cars passing, sunlight shifting across the pavement. But inside my small house, everything had changed. The woman who once wept quietly at a cruel message now sat watching the light bounce off her teacup, calm and unshaken. Respect had returned, not through anger, but through awareness. I didn't ruin my son's life. I didn't expose him publicly or shame his wife. I simply reminded them both that the foundation beneath their comfort was built by a pair of older hands. Hands that had signed, supported, and never once asked for anything back. The letter had done its work, and now, for the first time in years, I felt free. It was a Wednesday afternoon when he finally came. I knew he would. Guilt has a rhythm, and his was right on time. The sun was low, stretching long shadows across my porch in Dallas, the same porch where I used to wait for him to come home from school with scraped knees and a grin too wide for his face. Now, he stood at the gate, a grown man with tired eyes and a phone clutched like armor. I didn't rush to open the door. I let him stand there a moment, just to let the weight of it all settle. When I finally stepped out, the wind carried the faint smell of rain. He looked older than I remembered, but not from time, from guilt. He started talking before I could say a word, words tumbling like loose coins. Apologies, excuses, explanations. 1,000 ways to rearrange regret. I didn't interrupt. I just watched. His lips moved. His hands gestured. His eyes searched mine for mercy, but I stayed still. He said he didn't mean the message. He said he'd been under stress, that his wife had been emotional, that he hadn't realized how his words sounded. He said so many things, but none of them sounded like truth. I didn't answer right away. I let silence do what years of pleading couldn't. The kind of silence that feels heavier than shouting. When he finally ran out of breath, I turned toward the table on the porch. The folder was waiting there, thick, calm, unshaken. I placed it in front of him without a word. He looked down and froze. The contract stared back at him, my name clear and bold on the front page. For a moment, his hands trembled the way mine had when I opened his message. He looked up, eyes wide, like a man remembering something he'd buried too deep. I told him that paper had been sitting in my drawer for 15 years. I told him it had gathered dust, not resentment. I reminded him that when he needed help, I didn't hesitate. Not once. I signed everything. Not because I wanted control, but because I wanted him to succeed. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked at the papers again, as if hoping the words would change. But they didn't. They were written in ink, the kind that doesn't fade, no matter how much pride tries to rewrite it. I told him quietly that love doesn't demand repayment, but it does deserve recognition. I said that I didn't raise him to measure worth in dollars or deeds. I raised him to understand gratitude. And when that message came, those 7 cold words, I realized gratitude had died in our family long before respect did. He bowed his head then, his shoulders heavy. For the first time in years, I saw my boy again. Not the businessman, not the husband trying to save face, but the son who used to bring me daisy chains from the yard and call me his best friend. He whispered that he didn't know how to fix it. I told him it wasn't his job to fix the past. It was his job to face it. We sat in silence for a while. The wind rattled the porch chimes, the sound soft and familiar. I could see his reflection in the window, smaller somehow, humbled. He wasn't angry anymore, just lost. After a while, I pushed the contract toward him and said, "You didn't owe me love, but you owed me honesty." He nodded, eyes glassy, jaw tight. Then, without a word, he reached for my hand. His palm was warm, trembling. Mine was steady. I didn't squeeze back right away. I just let him hold it, let him feel the weight of what had been broken. The sky darkened above us. The first drops of rain began to fall, slow and hesitant. We sat there under the awning, 2 generations caught between what was given and what was forgotten. When the storm grew louder, he stood, took a deep breath, and said he'd make things right. I didn't ask what that meant. I'd heard enough promises in my life to know that actions speak better in silence. He left soon after, his car headlights cutting through the rain. I watched them disappear down the street, fading like an echo of everything we used to be. When the sound was gone, I turned back to the table. The folder was still there, damp at the edges but intact. I placed my hand on it gently. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure, the kind that doesn't shout or celebrate, just breathes quietly. Later that evening, I made a small dinner, soup and bread, and sat by the window watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement. My phone buzzed again. This time, his message was simple. "Thank you, Mom." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Some words are meant to end stories, not restart them. Outside, the rain slowed to a mist. I opened the window, letting the cool air drift in. The smell of wet earth filled the room. Clean, fresh, new. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger or sorrow. I just felt peace, the kind that comes when the truth finally stands taller than the pain. I didn't destroy my son. I reminded him who he was, and that, more than any paper or signature, was the justice I had been waiting for. The days after that meeting moved slower than usual, like the world itself was waiting to see what I'd do next. But I didn't do anything. I didn't need to. Truth, once spoken, has its own way of echoing. I woke up the next morning to quiet sunlight streaming through my curtains, soft and golden over the wooden floor. The storm had washed the city clean. Outside, puddles glimmered in the street, reflecting pieces of the Dallas sky. I made myself coffee and sat on the porch, the same chair where I'd faced him just a day ago. The folder was gone now, safely locked away in a drawer, but its memory lingered in the air like the faint scent of rain. It didn't take long for the ripples to reach him. Mr. Dalton called a few days later. His voice was calm, but beneath it I could hear the restrained satisfaction of a man who had seen justice work quietly. "Your son has begun reinstating your dividends, Mrs. Turner," he said. "A monthly share, as agreed in the original terms." I thanked him and smiled faintly. Money wasn't what I wanted, but the gesture meant he'd finally looked back and seen the path I'd walked for him. Weeks passed, and the calls began again. At first, they were formal, polite check-ins about paperwork, legal adjustments, financial reports. But slowly, they changed. He started asking about my health, about the garden, about whether I needed help with groceries. His tone softened with every word, as though he was learning how to be a son again, one apology at a time. I didn't rush to forgive him. Forgiveness, like trust, grows back in layers, fragile at first, then stronger with time. Some evenings, when he came by, he'd linger awkwardly by the door, unsure whether to hug me or stay back. I always let him choose. Healing can't be forced. It must unfold quietly, like morning light across old walls. One afternoon, he arrived with a bag of groceries and a bouquet of lilies. My favorite. He didn't say much, just unpacked everything, replaced the old milk, fixed the squeaky cabinet door he'd ignored for years. I watched him move around the kitchen, the same boy who used to sit on the counter swinging his legs while I made him pancakes. At one point, he looked up and caught me watching. His eyes flickered with something new. Humility, maybe, or realization. "You haven't changed this kitchen," he said softly. I just nodded. "Some things don't need changing," I replied. He stayed for dinner that night. I cooked a simple meal. Stew and cornbread, the kind we used to share when money was tight. We ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that lets the heart breathe again. As he was leaving, he placed an envelope on the table. "This is for you," he said. I didn't open it until after he left. Inside was a bank statement showing monthly deposits. Consistent, fair, automatic. Beneath it, a note written in his handwriting. "For everything you built that I forgot to thank you for." My chest tightened. Not from pride, but from peace. I folded the note carefully and tucked it between the pages of my Bible. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers around town began to fade. People who once gossiped now smiled kindly when they saw me at the Dallas Farmers Market, as if they'd learned something too. Even his wife changed. She began calling sometimes. Short, awkward conversations. But they mattered. She sounded careful now, softer than before. The pride in her voice had dulled. In its place was awareness. She even sent me photos of their little boy playing in the yard, his smile wide and pure, untouched by the mistakes of adults. Sometimes, when I saw that child's face, I thought of how cycles can break if one person chooses honesty over hurt. Maybe that was the point of it all. Not revenge, but redirection. To make sure the next branch of the tree grew straighter than the one before. I began to feel lighter. I tended my garden again, planting marigolds and basil by the fence. The earth felt forgiving beneath my hands, warm and alive. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness that once sat in my chest like a stone had dissolved into something gentler. Wisdom, maybe, or acceptance. Every time I passed by that drawer, the one holding the folder, I felt no temptation to open it. I didn't need to see my name on paper to remember my worth anymore. It was already written in the life I'd rebuilt. On Sundays, I'd take the bus downtown and walk near Clyde Warren Park, watching families gather with children laughing, couples holding hands, older parents sharing quiet meals under trees. I used to envy them once, but now I simply smiled. Everyone carries a story, some written in joy, some in lessons. Mine had both. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, my son came again. This time alone. No phone, no pretext. He sat beside me on the porch, the same place where everything had started. We didn't talk about business or money. We just talked. About the past. About Dad. About the kind of man he used to want to be. He admitted he'd lost sight of things after success came, that pride had blurred love, and fear of weakness had turned into cruelty. I listened, quietly, like I always had. When he finished, I told him something simple. You don't have to pay me back. You just have to live better. He nodded, eyes glistening. And for the first time in years, I saw gratitude. Not in his words, but in his silence. After he left, I stayed on the porch long after dark, watching the streetlights glow one by one. The night was still, but I felt movement inside me. Not restlessness, but healing. I understood then that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Through humility, through change, through quiet mornings when guilt turns into grace. The papers had restored what pride had stolen, but forgiveness restored what anger never could. I wasn't the woman they'd once dismissed. I was the woman who had taught them, without shouting, what respect really costs and what it's worth. The night air in Dallas carried a softness I hadn't felt in years. I sat on the porch, wrapped in my old shawl, the one my husband had bought me at the market near Elm Street, back when life was simpler. The house was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock inside. Steady, patient, alive. That rhythm reminded me that even when hearts break and mend again, time never stops waiting for anyone. I looked out at the streetlights, their glow stretching across the damp pavement. Each beam felt like a chapter from my life. Moments of warmth, of ache, of learning. I had lived through betrayal, silence, and regret. Yet here I was, still standing, still breathing, still capable of peace. On the table beside me lay the folder, the contract that had once felt like armor, then like proof, then finally just like paper. The ink had dried long ago, but its meaning had only recently come alive. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, the quiet kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. I thought of my son. For so long, I had carried the weight of disappointment like a stone in my chest, wondering if motherhood had been my mistake or my miracle. But as I sat there under that Texan sky, I realized that love and pain are twins, born from the same heart, shaped by the same memories. You can't have one without feeling the other. He had changed, slowly but sincerely. His visits had become more frequent, his tone gentler. Sometimes he'd come by just to mow the lawn or sit beside me without speaking. Once, he brought his little boy, my grandson, who ran through the yard with wild laughter, chasing a paper plane that fluttered in the wind. Watching him, I saw pieces of my son as a child, innocent and full of wonder. It was like seeing a wound heal in real time. I didn't need apologies anymore. I needed understanding. And that, finally, I had. Inside the house, the faint light from the kitchen window spilled onto the wooden floor. The photo frames on the wall caught the glow. Me holding him as a baby, our trip to Santa Fe, his college graduation where I'd cried too much and embarrassed him in front of his friends. Those pictures once felt like ghosts of what we'd lost. Now they felt like proof of what we'd survived. I picked up my teacup and took a slow sip. The warmth spread through me, gentle and grounding. Age teaches you that revenge burns fast and bright, but truth glows slowly, like embers that warm instead of destroy. Sometimes people ask if I regret what I did, reclaiming what was mine, forcing him to face what he'd forgotten. I always say no. Because I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it to wake him. To remind him that respect isn't inherited. It's chosen. And sometimes it takes a hard lesson for that choice to become clear. My son once told me that he wanted to teach his own boy about success. I hope now he teaches him something greater, gratitude. Because that's the foundation of every lasting thing, not wealth, not pride, but thankfulness. The clock chimed softly inside. I smiled and leaned, back, feeling the cool night breeze touch my face. For years, I had looked for justice in apologies and gestures. Now I knew justice had already arrived the moment I decided to stop begging for worth and start standing in it. The contract would stay locked away, untouched. Not as a threat, but as a memory. A quiet reminder that love without respect is fragile. And that sometimes, to rebuild it, you have to let it break first. I turned off the porch light and looked one last time at the street before going inside. The world outside was dark, but inside, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. Before I went to bed, I opened my journal and wrote a single line across the top of the page. He said he owed me nothing, but a mother's love always writes its own receipt. Then I closed the book and whispered softly, "Thank you, God, for giving me peace after truth." If you're listening to this, wherever you are, remember this. You can't teach love through anger, and you can't earn respect through silence. But when the world tries to forget what you've done, let your actions remind them louder than your words ever could. Tell me, if your child looked at everything you built and said, "We don't owe you anything," would you forgive them? Or would you let the truth speak for you?